Good morning to everyone. It is good to be with you here today. Hold on one second. Okay. Yes, so we've been out of town and now we're back, so glad to be here. And so it's good to see everyone. I know. I'm glad it's so unbelievable that you knew I was faking. We've been in Wisconsin for a few weeks now. Every year, my wife and I work at a Christian youth camp in Wisconsin. And the first night that we had everyone gathered around the campfire for evening devo, I was introducing our camp theme, and I walked up and did a little something like this, and they didn't know I was pretending. Even though I feel disgusting doing what I just did, it was for a point, and it warms my heart to know that you guys knew I was joking. But these are middle schoolers, and they didn't know I was joking, and because that's their life, and they see that every day, right? So I use that as a way to jump into the theme of our session, which was a word taken from Psalm 86 that we read today, and it was the word undivided. Undivided. The psalmist prays for God to give him an undivided heart. That's the old 1984, what is now the old 1984 NIV version. And other translations say it differently, but I like that phrase, undivided. Give me an undivided heart. And we talked about, we know what it's like to have undivided attention, like what I was just doing with my cell phone, trying to talk to a group of people, but also paying attention to what's inside my little black rectangle here too. This one, not this one. So we all understand what it means to be divided in our attention. I'm focused on my phone. I'm also trying to talk to someone in real life right in front of me. Okay, we do that every day, all day long. But the psalmist is talking about something a little bit different, talking about a divided heart. And he knows what that is, and someone like David has experienced that before, and I think all of us have as well. And so we spent a 2-week session talking about what it means to become undivided, uniting our heart. God knows that we have a heart for him. God knows that I have a heart for him, and I want to follow him and to obey him and to be like him and to live my life that honors him. He knows that. But he knows I also have another heart that sometimes seeks other things as well. And there's a battle there. And the prayer of Psalm 86 is to give me an undivided heart. I don't want a heart that's divided and seeking more than one thing, but just a united heart to seek God. So for these middle schoolers, we spent 2 weeks talking about what it means to be undivided. And one of the best places to do that turns out to be the Epistle of James. So while we borrowed a word from Psalm 86, what we were discovering is that the entire Epistle of James is about this very thing, about how to live an undivided life. And I'm not going to preach through the book of James today or tell you all this stuff. Maybe we can do a series on that at some point in the future. But what we discovered along the way is that the book of James has some really hard-hitting, really difficult, challenging passages. And, he doesn't start off pulling any punches either. We just read what Scott read and Dave Perry read in chapter 1. Consider it pure joy whenever you face trials of many kinds. So that's not my go-to emotion or response to trials. Maybe it's yours, but that's difficult already. And that's like the first verse of James. So this book doesn't hold back. It's very challenging, very, very challenging, and really convicting if you're the one teaching it. And so it was really convicting all the way through. But one of the great themes in James, and one that comes up right away here in this first section in chapter 1, happens to be the secret to living an undivided life. The secret to living an undivided life. And he says it pretty soon here in chapter 1. Let's just read the first few verses here. Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance, and perseverance must finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking in anything. If any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to him. Okay? This is the NIV version that I was reading from. If you lack wisdom, ask God. Did you know that God is a generous God? Did you know that God is a loving, giving, generous God, that all he wants to do is pour out gifts upon his children? And the most precious gift, one of the most precious gifts that he has, the most precious gift that he has, is wisdom. And he longs to pour out his wisdom, give his wisdom to us. And James says, all you have to do is ask. But the next verses, right after that, verse 5, if any of you lacks wisdom, ask God who gives generously. Verse 6, but when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea blown and tossed in the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Such a person is double-minded and unstable in all they do. So here we get to the dividedness again, right? James uses, in his Greek way, he talks about a heart. In the Old Testament Hebrew text, or James talks about the mind in a Greek way, the same thing that an Old Testament Hebrew author would use the word heart. It's the same thing. Double-hearted, double-minded, divided. That's what James says. You can't say to God, I want your wisdom, but also kind of being reserved in your commitment to follow through with what that wisdom is going to do and produce in your life. You have to be undivided in your pursuit, in your request for wisdom. Not that I'm just going to ask for wisdom because it'd be nice to have, but I don't know if I'm really in the mood to really pursue it or live out what that wisdom looks like in my life. He says, that person should not ask for wisdom. But if you ask for wisdom with an undivided mind, an undivided heart, God pours that out upon you generously because he loves to give his precious gifts. And later, we find out what that wisdom looks like in chapter 3 of James. Towards the end of the chapter there, says, verse 17, but wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, and then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial, and sincere. Now, I don't know about you, when I hear the word wisdom, these are not necessarily the first things that come to mind. But James says, if you seek the wisdom of God, this is what it produces. This is the fruit that wisdom bears in your life. If you want to identify a wise person in this room this morning, then you will be identifying someone whose life looks like this. Wisdom from above is first of all pure, peace-loving, and considerate, and submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial, sincere. And then he says, peacemakers who sow in peace raise a harvest of righteousness. A harvest of righteousness comes to those who live out wisdom in their life, and it looks like this. So these are the things that we were exploring in our camp session, and that took us through about the first week, the first half. And halfway through the session, we had a worship service on Sunday morning all together, and there I was doing the message that morning on Sunday morning, and I told a story to these middle school kids, and I told them it was a scary story from when I was a child. I will summarize it for you. I won't tell you the whole thing, but I said to them when I was your age, middle school, 7th, 8th, 9th grade or something, I told them this story about when my family moved to a new house. And this new house, it was nice. It was a good size for our family, had a nice yard. But behind our house was this huge hill, what to me seemed like a mountain. But it was this huge hill, and we were new there, and so I would go out exploring, and I would explore this big hill behind us. And you could see from our house that there were a couple houses on this big hill behind us. So I went exploring, and I walked by. It's kind of I don't know if it's totally thickly wooded, but there was trees and stuff. There was paths to walk on and that sort of thing. And I got to this opening, this clearing in the path, and there was a woman there that met me. She was middle-aged, and her name was Prudence. Her nickname was Prudy. And so I met Prudy, and she said, "Oh, come on in, I want to show you the woman that I live with and I care for." And so she brought me to the front of the house, and there was this woman who was the oldest woman I've ever seen in my life. She was, to me, she looked like she was 1,000 years old. But there was also like some sort of youthfulness to her as well. Maybe you've seen someone like that. And she was there just, working in the garden a little bit. And she turned around, and she was so excited to see me, to meet me. "How old are you?" she asked me, and I said, whatever. I said 14 or something. And I said, "How old are you?" And she said, "Don't you know I've been here around longer than any of this other stuff?" And I thought she was pointing. I couldn't tell if she was pointing to like the trees and nature, or to the whole world, or what. And she said her name's Miss Hakma. And so Miss Hakma said, "Do you want to come inside? I just prepared a bunch of this really good fruit." And so she invited me inside this modest home. The memorable thing about the outside were these like 7 columns, pillars, but the rest of it was pretty modest. But once you got inside, it was astonishing what was in there. She was a collector of ancient artifacts, and she had these awesome things from like ancient Egypt, all these ancient civilizations, ancient Egypt, ancient Mesopotamia, you name it. There was tons of cool stuff from all of human history in there. These collections of like coins and jewelry. It was really, really awesome. It was like being in a museum, really. Like she knew all about all of history. And I was just amazed. Even though I was just a middle schooler, I was like blown away. This was incredible stuff. And we sit down at her table, and she has this amazing bowl of fruit, all of my favorite stuff, like the greatest blueberries and purple grapes and strawberries and all sorts of good stuff. And and I start to eat it, and I remember we started talking, and every word she said was just like life-giving. Everything she was saying, imparting to me, was so wise and so true and so beautiful and so life-giving. I felt alive being there, you know. And I finally asked her about, how much is this stuff worth around your house, and where did you get it from? And she said, I remember, she said, don't you know that the most valuable thing in this whole house is sitting right here in this bowl on the table? And she was talking about the fruit. So that stuck with me. And we continued to talk, and then I had to leave, okay? So I left. That's not the scary part. The scary part of the story comes next, because after I left Miss Hockman's house, then I went to along the trail, and I knew kind of where I was going. I could tell if I was going up or down a hill, you know. So I was going up, and it was getting later in the afternoon, but I said, well, I'll continue exploring. And this path took me to the very top of the hill. And at the very top of the hill was this super impressive, what to me I would have called like a mansion, but it wasn't maybe as big as a mansion. But I got to the top of the hill, and I hear this voice calling out to me. And this voice is like this scruffy old voice, kind of annoying, abrasive voice from some old woman. And I keep walking, and there's another clearing, and I see this woman sitting on her porch, magnificent house, like incredible looking on the outside, really impressive. And she's smoking like 7 cigarettes at once, just like trying to, calling me over. Come over here, boy. What's your name? And I told her, and she said her name's Miss Stolta. And I wish I could reproduce her voice and her demeanor. It's just really uncomfortable. I didn't like really anything about her. I didn't really like talking to her at all. And I was really uncomfortable. But she didn't really have anything good or worthwhile to say. She just talked about herself mostly. But she invited me inside her house. She's like, hey, you want some snacks or whatever? And I'm like, yeah, fine, I'll go in. And she brings me in her house, and it was totally the opposite of Miss Hockma's house. Her house was, it looked like a herd of middle school kids had been through it and destroyed everything, There's holes in the walls, broken down, nothing works, bad paint, and furniture is like old and broken. Nothing to speak of that's of any value or worth in her house, and it was like dark and dank, and it was just really uncomfortable, really bad place to be. But she sat me down at her dimly lit kitchen table, and I said, I probably should be going now. I was starting to feel really uncomfortable with Mrs. Stolta. I probably should be going. I don't know if, I got to get home pretty soon. My parents might be looking for me. She's like, no, you just sit right here and let's just talk. And I said, okay, well. So I listened to her babble and cackle on about some stories about herself. And the one part I remember is that she put in front of me this this weird loaf of bread and this cup of water. And I remember her saying, here, eat this bread and drink this water. And she said, stolen water is sweet, and bread eaten in secret is delicious. Just a really weird thing to say to a kid, right? Stolen water is sweet, and bread eaten in secret is delicious. Well, now I was freaking out. I do not want to be in this house with this woman anymore. And I said, I gotta go. And I tried to stand up from the chair, and she puts her hand on my shoulder and makes me sit back down. And she says, boy, don't you know, everyone who's ever sat in that chair ends up dead. And then I freaked out and ran out of there and went home. And like the beginning of the sermon with the cell phone, that didn't happen in real life in history, that story. I told the campers that the story I just told you didn't actually happen, not in the literal way that I described it, but that is the most true story of my life and of anyone's life. What I did was borrow imagery from Proverbs chapter 9. And if you read Proverbs chapter 9, you'll see a description of wisdom. In Hebrew, it's the word chokmah. And the way I kind of describe, took some liberty, but the way I tell the story is me visiting wisdom's house, which is how it's described in the text in Proverbs 9. And it contrasts it with this other woman whose name is Folly, and in Latin it's Stulta. And I used the imagery from Proverbs 9 to describe this woman, okay? So I was telling a story of the encounters that we all have in our life. All of us have visited Miss Chokmah's house. We have sat at her table, and the text says that her fruit is more precious than gold or silver. That is the most important thing that we can have in our lives. But we've also sat at the table of Miss Stulta. All of us. We have chosen foolishness, which the scripture says ends in death. And that story is a lot scarier than the pretend story I told of a middle school boy walking up a hill one day. That the way of folly literally ends in death. Her guests, like the text says, really do all end up in Sheol, in the grave. And that's the scariest story that we can tell and that we can live. And it's true of all of us. The chapter before Proverbs 9 is called Proverbs 8. They knew what they were doing. And it's a beautiful chapter that describes the creation of the world, and it's a celebration of this character named Wisdom. And Wisdom talks about how wisdom was there from the beginning, and that through wisdom all things were created. That wisdom was there alongside God, creating everything and delighting in all of creation, and especially in humankind. And that day, we made a discovery in Colessions chapter 1. That day, we discovered that the very same language that Proverbs chapter 8 uses to describe wisdom is used by the Apostle Paul to describe Jesus. Listen to how he describes it in Colossians 1, verse 15. He, talking about Jesus, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things were created by him and for him. Exactly the way wisdom is described in Proverbs chapter 8. Verse 17, he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all of his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. And so Paul, and this this isn't the only place in the New Testament that does this, but Paul helps us make this incredible discovery that humans who throughout history, as we have been seeking the wisdom of God, the big surprise is what we've ultimately been seeking is Christ. That everything that was promised in wisdom, not only the function and the activities of wisdom throughout history, but also the promise and the blessing of life that comes through wisdom. Paul opens the curtain and he says, we've been talking about Jesus Christ all along. It's in Jesus that you find ultimate life and value. The text that we read in James chapter 3, what does it mean to have wisdom? Remember, wisdom is first of all pure and all the rest that follows. That is a life that looks like Christ. That when we live out a life of wisdom, we're living out a Christ-like life. Jesus and wisdom overlap in Scripture. And when we seek wisdom, what we ultimately find is Christ. And that's good news, Paul says, because all of us have sat down in the wrong house, at the wrong table, and eaten the fruit that is not from wisdom, eaten the fruit of folly. And as we know, that table, all of her guests end up in the grave, end up dead. Paul says, through Jesus Christ, there's an invitation. All of us who are dead in the grave, who have sat at the table of folly, who have done the wrong thing, he says, through Jesus, God has reconciled to himself all things. Through Christ, all things were made, and all of us, we have chosen folly, but through Christ, now all things that were created are reconciled to God. Things on earth, things in heaven, because he has made peace through his blood, which was shed on the cross. And that's the gospel. We are dead in our trespasses and sins because we've chosen folly. But thanks be to God, because his wisdom, the Messiah, our Lord, has shed his blood on the cross and has offered us a new table, his fruit of the vine, his bread, his body, and says, take, eat of this, and you will live. Come to these waters, come to my table, and you will have life. And that's the gospel. This is the gospel that we shared with the campers, and this is the gospel that we share in together this morning and celebrate. So I want to encourage us this week to, first of all, spend some time in Proverbs 8 and 9. It's a really, really good text. Spend some time in the Epistle of James. See what it's like to be convicted and challenged by the Word of God, and to hear the challenge of what it looks like to live an undivided life. And most of all, I want to encourage us to live lives of wisdom, to live out that Christ-like wisdom at the end of James chapter 3. Take some time to revisit that text this week as well. Let's stand and sing. Derek will lead us in song.